Apollo 10.5, A Space-Age Childhood. This is certainly a different kind of movie we got here, isn't it? Well, that's what you'd have to expect from Richard Linklater, who is known for being quite a versatile filmmaker, capable of exploring several different genres, but still able to craft them in his own way of storytelling. From mainstream hits like School of Rock, to Oscar contenders like Boyhood, to romantic dramas like the Before trilogy, to experimental animated films. The latter, for me, is especially interesting, since they go far beyond what we normally expect from the ones by big-name studios. You got Waking Life, that's all about a discussion of life and death from numerous of perspectives, and A Scanner Darkly that is an adaptation of the Philip K. Dick book of the same name, both told with unique rotoscope-style visuals that can be considered as a very rare breed of animation. In the case of Apollo 10.5, it looks like it's going to be no different, only this time, he's going to be taking a kid along with the audience to an unforgettable trip to the moon. So now that we're ready to launch this review, will this feel like witnessing a historical moment like 11? Or will this be as disastrous as Challenger? Let's find out. The story. In a way, there are two parts to the title of the movie, each of them highlighting what this film is about. The first one is Apollo 10.5, emphasizing the main narrative about a boy who was assigned on a top-secret mission to land on the moon days before the historical Apollo 11 mission, and goes through all the training before ultimately making it up there. And the other is A Space-Age Childhood, where it becomes a documentary of sorts where it chronicles the average life during the late 1960s from the perspective of a fictional boy from a suburban family in Houston, Texas, as it presents all the cultural events that happened during that time and how they've shaped the life of kids back then, while also showing their carefree life where safety can be a low priority at times.
The truck bed full of kids on the way to the beach. It never crossed anyone's mind that we were all just one slight collision or rollover away from being roadkill.
I'll say right now that both parts can work well in their own right. The former is good to hook viewers with an interesting concept of a kid being sent to the moon and what he and his team had to go through in order to accomplish that mission, while the second is like a nostalgic time capsule as Linklater reminisces about what it's like to grow up in the 1960s. However, this is where the filmmaker's experimental nature kind of lost me. Maybe this is my fault because I set my expectations differently, but I came into this thinking that this would at least primarily be about the kid going to the moon. To my surprise, more than half of the feature is actually dedicated to the 60s nostalgia. I was hoping that maybe this could lead to something, that it could help build the character of Stanley or establish the world building and the people in there to prepare us for the big moment. But unfortunately, the 60s element is the dominant force that barely helps out the narrative and mostly spends its time telling the audience, hey, remember the 1960s? What a cool time that was!
At night, the games moved indoors or on the back porch. So many classic board games.
5, 6.
And the worst part is that it spends so much time reminiscing about the 60s that the moon plot ultimately feels like an afterthought. Almost as if it's like a coincidence that the film is set during the Apollo 11 moon landing, resulting in the big moment when the kid landed feel less than satisfying. And because of that, I can't help but feel like I've been lied to. It promised me this great concept and threw it away because the movie wants to cater to this niche audience so that they can feel nostalgic over a specific time period. If the movie wanted to be about life in the 1960s, that's perfectly fine. But it should have been more honest and straightforward about it instead of implementing a story that they weren't really going to tell anyways. There could have been ways where the plot and the nostalgia would have blended well to get viewers fully invested. Maybe if the 1960s element were a lot more about America's obsession with space travel, the dream of walking on the moon, and even the controversy of the Apollo mission at the time, then it probably would have complemented the story to highlight the importance of having the kid there.
Cash they wasted, as far as I'm concerned, in getting to the moon could have been used to feed poor black people in Harlem and all over the place, all over this country.
Unfortunately, it only does so a little bit at a time, and their contribution wasn't valued enough to make the space theme feel significant. Again, they're just coincidental factors to what was happening in the 60s. There are some good ideas to create a strong story and an interesting film. The problem is that it doesn't know if it wants to tell either a linear narrative or a documentary, and unless you're part of the movie's demographic or really interested in that decade, there's not a whole lot that the story offers. The animation. As I said before, this is a very uncommon style of rotoscoping animation. Unlike some of the more known uses like classic Disney, this is pure rotoscoping where every frame was traced from the film footage, but still has the creative freedom to add onto the images, a technique that Linklater has grown accustomed to with some of his past films. Another example of this style done in the past is some of the Ralph Bakshi movies like American Pop, Fire and Ice, and his adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. With Apollo 10½, I must say that this is the director's best looking film yet. I'm not saying that the animation of either Waking Life or A Scanner Darkly is bad. They do look good in their own right, especially in an experimental way. It's just that there are times, especially with Darkly, where it often feels like he and his team were trying to figure out how to pull off the visual technique he wanted to do without looking too much like some weird filter placed over the film. This movie, on the other hand, feels like they finally got the technology down and managed to get the style look clean and consistent. It manages to capture the actors and their movements well to maintain the realism and show their faces more clearly to highlight their emotions, while the animation helps make the colors brighter to emphasize the tone of childhood and make the mood feel more pleasant as we experience Stanley's young life.
But it was always so fun. Cars and gritty hot dogs be damned.
But I know that this still leaves one big question. If the visuals are trying to be as real as possible from the footage that they have filmed, then what's the point of this being animated in the first place? Why not just have this be a live-action movie then? Well, it's technically true that it's probably cheaper to draw the backgrounds instead of using real sets or complexly detailed CGI, especially when some of it is set in a space station to send a kid to the moon. Apollo 10½ does have a reason for it to be fully animated. As it is a feature that fully embraces the 1960s, the designs reflect that as well. A key to capturing that 60s feel is have the animation reflect the graphic design of the time. Generally, the style stays within the main rotoscope look that is similar to pop art, while also taking advantage of the medium to highlight the decor of the era to have those details be more prominent. But it also plays around with other looks whenever it presents B-roll, archived footage, or clips from TV shows and movies to still capture the same 60s feel, but in different ways, like how some scenes look like a living silkscreen print.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
If there is one thing that I do applaud this movie for, it's how it presents the cleanest result of Linklater's rotoscoping style, and how it came out as great-looking animation that you'll most likely won't find anywhere else. The characters. As a movie about sending a kid to space, you want to take the time to know the boy himself and the crew setting up this operation so that you can be emotionally invested in the mission and see how going to the moon can change a kid's life. Too bad that the film's nostalgia goggles won't fully let us have that story, so there is no time to know anyone in the film. One drawback from its 60s look back is how it makes any established characters feel kind of pointless. Why develop any personalities when none are the main focus in the first place? For the most part, They're like the exemplary American family at the time that the viewer follows as they explore what living in the 1960s looked like. It really sucks because they feel like they started out with some strong potential, but their use ends up feeling insignificant, especially Glenn Powell and Zachary Levi as the guys from NASA. With their top-notch performance, they show dedication to work with what they have and make sure they get to the moon before the Russians do. But they didn't get enough screen time to emphasize why their mission means so much to them.
But we need to test this accidentally smaller version on the lunar surface and soon. And we need a kid like you.
Stan, you're our only hope. Come on, what do you say? Do it for your country. Do it for the free world.
And then there's Stanley, the main boy of the picture, who is loosely based on Linklater's own childhood. There are many ways to have the kid be impactful to the film. Show how the training affects him physically and mentally, what his coming-of-age transition is when he makes it to the moon, and highlight how he feels when watching the Apollo 11 mission not long after he did his travel. However, none of those ideas were put in use, and Stanley is mostly shown as just the typical American boy. An avatar for the audience to experience his life in his shoes as he lives with his parents and 5 other siblings. The most personality that he expresses is not when he's a kid, but when his adult self is narrating, voiced by Jack Black. Funny enough, I'd say that Black is actually one of the better parts of the picture, because as we go through this entire 60s nostalgia trip, Jack does a good job explaining what's going on as if he's casually ruminating about his own childhood.
With school looming the next morning, no matter how good that particular show, the freedom and fun of the weekend was coming to a close.
As for the rest of the cast, they mostly play the one-note role of Stanley's family members with maybe one extra trait. Rather it be his older brothers and older sisters, whom some are still kids and others are teenagers, his smoking and stern mother, and his dad who always looks for morally questionable ways to save money. It's not that I hate these characters. In fact, one credit I will give this is that the movie does supply some good acting, but there's just little to no attention given to them where their personalities feel insignificant to the feature. I never thought I'd say this, but they actually made an animated feature for boomers. Seriously, this is a movie made for Netflix, released in 2022, and it feels like boomers are the prime target audience. Guess they need their cartoons too. Apollo 10.5: A Space Age Childhood is a movie that is technically well crafted, but it has a problem of figuring out what it wants to tell. Granted, it has the right materials to create a solid picture, like great rotoscoping animation and good actors, but it's like it has an identity crisis and doesn't know what it wants to be. Is it a coming-of-age story about a boy going to the moon? Is it a slice-of-life film about growing up during the American trend of space travel? Or is it a documentary about life during the 1960s? It tries to do all of that at the same time, but it ends up losing its sense of direction and feels like it's a movie made for a very specific type of audience who could tolerate a whole feature length's worth of "back in my day." Anyone else outside of that will most likely end up feeling bored and disconnected with what it offers. Now, I can totally accept that this could be a case that this movie is just not for me, because I can see for certain people that they will love it. Rather it be for those who had their childhood during the 1960s, or whoever is interested in the subject of the 1960s decade, then they will certainly get a kick out of this. But as it is my review, I just think it's not great. There's some good stuff in it, but it's not something that I'm planning on revisiting soon. And before I rate this movie, I just want to give out a quick reminder to go and subscribe in case you haven't. I do this every week, so if you're liking this, then I'm sure you'll have a great time if you subscribe.
Okay, pause. Let's forget about all this for now.